Hello. We will be talking about the electronic structure of the electron cloud. So we know now that the atom is made of a nucleus and an electron cloud. But the electrons are confined into specific regions around the nucleus. And being in that specific regions gives them a particular amount of energy. These regions are occupied by the electrons are called principal energy levels or shells, and they are represented by the principal quantum number n. So the shells are numbered from n equal 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. So the way the atom is built, you start with the nucleus in the center, and as you move away from it, you have the first shell, with the lowest amount of energy that electrons can have. And that's the n equal 1 shell. Then as you move away from the nucleus, you add another shell, the n equal 2 shell, with a higher level of energy than the first. And as you move farther away from the nucleus, comes the third shell with n equals 3, and then the fourth shell, etc. So the further away from the nucleus, the higher the shell number and the higher in energy the electrons are. Each shell corresponds to a period in the periodic table. Remember, periods are the rows. So elements in the same period will have electrons in the same shells. And you can see that the first period, the first shell, has only 2 elements, and you can only fill that shell with only 2 electrons. The second period has 2 electrons in the left, and then 6 electrons more to the right. So you can put more electrons into it. And you can see as you go down the table that the periods have more and more elements in them. So the shells gets larger in size as you move away from the nucleus, and you can put more electrons into them. So the larger the number, n, the farther the electrons are from the nucleus, and the more electrons can be held in those shells. Shells are subdivided into subshells, and the subshells have different energy. And in order of energy, they are identified by the letters S, P, D, and F. So if we look at the structure of the atom again, starting with the first shell right around the nucleus, the first shell has only 1 subshell, because the shell number indicates the number of subshells are in that shell. So the first shell has only 1 subshell. The second shell has 2 subshells, the 2s and the 2p, with the 2s being lower in energy than the 2p. Then the third shell has 3 subshells, the 3s, the 3p, and the 3d, in order of energy. Then comes the fourth shell with 4 subshells, the 4s, the 4p, the 4d, and 4f, in order of energy. You can notice here that the third shell and the fourth shell are overlapping, and the 4s subshell is lower in energy than the 3d subshell. And because electrons are filling the shells in order of energy, the 4s subshell will be filled before the 3d. Each subshell is representing a different type of orbital. So what is an orbital? An orbital is a region of space where the probability of finding an electron is very high. Let's mention that each orbital can hold 2 electrons maximum. When people do electronic structures of the elements, the orbitals are drawn as little square, and the electrons are drawn as an arrow up and an arrow down. So let's look at the figure to the right with the coordinate axis X, Y, and Z. Let's say that the nucleus of the atom that is represented there is positioned in the coordinate 0, 0, 0. If we were able to take a picture of the electrons inside that atom, and the electrons would show up as blue dots, and let's say that we would be able to take thousands and thousands of pictures, every time we would take a picture, the dot would have moved and be in different places. And if we were to superimpose those pictures, we would obtain this density plot that shows the positions of the electron with time. You can see that the electrons are mainly around the nucleus. The density of the dots around the nucleus is higher than farther away from the nucleus. As you move farther from the nucleus, you can see the density of the dots decreases. So what is an orbital? It's the region where the probability of finding the electron is very high. And so it's an envelope that includes 95% of the dots. So in this case, the envelope would be spherical, centered around the nucleus. And 95% of the dots would be included in that sphere, and 5% would be outside. And so that would be a spherical orbital. So we said that the subshells are made of orbitals. And the number of orbitals varies depending on the type of subshell. For example, the S subshell has one orbital only. The P subshell has 3 orbitals. The D subshell has 5 orbitals, and the F subshell has 7 orbitals. So if we look at our energy diagram with the nucleus at the bottom of this energy scale, the first shell that comes around the nucleus is the first shell, and it contains only one subshell and one orbital, the 1s. As you move farther away from the nucleus and higher in energy comes the second shell with 2 subshells, the 2s and the 2p. The 2s is only made of 1 orbital, and the 2p are made of 3 orbitals. The 3 2p orbitals have the same amount of energy. That's why they are in a line. Then comes the third shell with 3 subshells, the S, the P, and the D. The 3s subshell has only 1 orbital. The P subshell has 3 orbitals, and the D subshell has 5 orbitals. Then comes the 4th shell with 4 subshells, the S, the P, and the D, and the F, but the F is not represented in this drawing. Notice how, again, we see the overlap of the 3rd and the 4th shell, and the 4s orbital is lower in energy than the 3d orbital. So because electrons are filling orbitals in order of energy, they will fill the 4s orbital before they fill the 3d orbitals. And notice also that the overlapping of shells also happen between the 4th and the 5th shell, because we can see here the 5s orbital being lower in energy than the 4d orbitals. So what are the shapes of these orbitals, of these regions of high probability of finding the electrons? The s orbital has the slimest of the shapes. It's a spherical shape, centered around the nucleus. The difference between the 1s, the 2s, and the 3s orbitals is the size. As you move up in shell numbers, you have a larger orbital. 2s is larger than 1s, and 3s is larger again, or is centered around the nucleus. The p orbitals have a dumbbell shape. There are 3 p orbitals, and so 3 dumbbell shape centered, aligned along the z-axis, the x-axis, or the y-axis. If you put them together, it gives the drawing to the right, where all dumbbell shapes are put together and centered around the nucleus. So the difference between the 2p orbitals and the 3p orbitals, for example, is that they're both centered around the nucleus, but the 3p orbitals would just be a larger dumbbell, including the 2p orbitals. These represents the shapes of the d orbitals. There are 5 d orbitals. They're made of 2 dumbbell shapes perpendicular to each other, and inside the xy plane, or the yz plane, and the xz plane along the x or y axis, and 1 dumbbell shape around the along the z-axis with a donut around it. We are not showing you the f orbitals because they are even more complicated. There's 7 of them, and we don't ask you to remember this shape. So the periodic table, I told you, it's a powerful tool that enables you to know which shells, subshells, and orbitals are filled when you look at an element. We said that the shells are represented by the periods. Periods are the rows. And so period 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are shells. Period 1 represents the filling of the first shell, and the first shell has only one s orbital. And so, because there can be only 2 electrons in there, there's only 2 elements in the first shell, in the first period. Hydrogen with 1 electron in the left, and then helium with 2 electrons on the right. Then the first shell is filled. We move down on the second period and start filling the 2s orbital. And that's lithium and beryllium. And from there we go straight to the 2p line. And the 2p line here represents the filling of the 2p orbitals. There are 6 colons in the 2p line because you can put 6 electrons in the 2p subshell. Remember, there are 3 p orbitals in the p subshell. 3 orbitals times 2 electrons each, and that's 6 electrons total in the 2p subshell. As the 2p subshell is filled, the second shell is filled. Then we go down to the third period and fill the 3s orbital with 2 electrons. Then again move straight to the right and fill the 3p orbitals with 6 electrons. Then we go down to the fourth period, and you remember how the 4s orbitals were lower in energy than the 3d? And this is shown here that we fill the 4s orbitals before the 3d orbitals are filled. In the d block here, the 3d orbitals, there are 5 of them, 2 electrons each that means you can put 10 electrons in the D subshells. That's why the D block contains 10 colons, because you can put 10 electrons in the D subshell. And once the 3D subshell is full, then we move to the 4P subshell and fill it with 6 electrons, etc. You go down the periods and the periodic table and fill all these orbitals and subshells. So the S block here, represented in blue, has only 2 colons. Two colons because you can put 2 electrons in the S orbital, no more. Then the P block, represented in purple here, has 6 colons because you can put 6 electrons in each P subshell. The D block has 10 colons because you can put 10 electrons in the D subshell. And then represented here in green, the inner transition metals correspond to the filling of the F subshell. There are 7 orbitals in the F subshells. 7 orbitals times 2 electrons each, that's 14 electrons that are needed to fill the F subshell. That's why the inner transition metals, those 2 rows here, have 14 colons for 14 electrons. Remember that these inner transition metals should be normally located between the S block and the D block at the level of the 6 and 7 period. So the periodic table would be much wider and start on the left with the S block, then the F block at the level of the 6 and 7 period, then the D block from the 4th to the 7th period, and then the P block from the 2nd to the 7th period. This is how, if you look at the periodic table and find an element there, you can retrieve its electronic structure from its position in the periodic table.